Keeping a good partner isn't complicated and it isn't expensive. It doesn't require therapy or a stack of self-help books or a framework of love languages and attachment styles memorized like scripture. Underneath most of that, it comes down to two things: peace and genuine desire, freely given rather than metered out. And a lot of relationships are quietly dying right now for a reason nobody wants to say out loud. Not because one partner is asking for too much, but because the other partner has learned to treat those two things as negotiable. Something to be granted or withheld depending on what they're getting back in return. This is Robbin, and this is The Honest Ledger. Today we're opening the books on leverage. What happens when peace and intimacy stop being freely given and start being currency, what that actually does to the person on the receiving end over years, not days, and how to tell the difference between honest engagement and a slow campaign designed to make resistance more expensive than compliance. One thing needs to be said clearly, and I'll only say it once. This isn't a video that says women, or wives specifically, are the ones who do this. This pattern shows up in either partner in any relationship. A husband can withhold financial security, decision-making, respect, or affection just as easily as anyone else can withhold intimacy or peace. What we're diagnosing is a mechanism, not a gender. If you recognize this pattern in yourself before you recognize it in your partner, that's actually the more useful place to catch it. Let's open the ledger. The first entry in the ledger is what peace actually is, because most people underestimate it entirely. Peace isn't just the absence of an argument in a given moment. It's a specific physical feeling, shoulders dropping, jaw unclenching, a mind that finally slows from the speed it's been running at all day. It's the feeling of arriving somewhere that costs you nothing, where nobody needs something from you the second you walk through the door, where you don't have to read the room before deciding how to hold yourself. For a lot of men specifically, that feeling isn't a luxury. It's closer to a requirement, the same category as sleep, something the rest of a person's capacity actually draws from. A man who gets genuine peace at home is a man who can sustain his work, his patience, his presence with his kids, his ability to keep showing up for everyone who depends on him. Picture a man who can feel the difference physically between a calm evening at home and one where the air is tense the second he walks in. His body knows before his mind fully registers it. What this costs a relationship, when peace becomes something dispensed only when a partner is satisfied with how things are going, is the one resource everything else was quietly running on. On the ledger, peace, converted from a baseline into a reward, which changes what it actually means every time it's granted. Once peace becomes conditional, it stops functioning as rest at all, because part of a person's mind is always tracking whether the current calm is safe to actually sink into or liable to be withdrawn the moment something displeases the person controlling it. Real rest requires trust that it won't be taken back. Conditional peace can't provide that, no matter how calm the house looks on any given evening. The second entry is the difference between honest disagreement and a war of attrition. And this is where a lot of damage happens without either person clocking it as damage. Picture a man who takes a position on something, a financial decision, how to spend a weekend, something his partner wants that he doesn't think is a good idea right now. The honest version of what happens next is a real conversation. She brings her actual reasoning, he brings his. They work it out as two adults. The corrosive version looks different. Instead of engaging his reasoning directly, the disagreement turns into a campaign. The same point raised again in a different form a few days later. A low-grade tension that colors ordinary moments until he finally gives in just to make the tension stop. When he does give in that way, not because he was actually persuaded, but because resistance became more exhausting than compliance, that's not a resolution. It's an erosion. What gets damaged in that exchange isn't just his position on one decision. It's a small piece of his belief that his voice actually matters in the relationship, rather than being something to be worn down until he moves out of the way. On the ledger, a decision won, at the cost of a partner's confidence that his perspective is actually heard rather than simply outlasted. Do this enough times and the relationship doesn't have a partner who genuinely agrees anymore. It has someone who complies without conviction, and a person who complies without conviction has, in every way that matters emotionally, already left a relationship he's still physically standing inside of. The third entry is what that erosion produces over time, and it's almost always misread by the person who caused it. A man who's learned that offering his opinion costs more than it produces eventually stops offering it before anyone even asks. Not because he stopped having one, because he's run the experiment enough times to know how it usually ends. He goes quiet. He answers when asked and keeps the rest to himself. From the outside, that quiet gets labeled as, "He never talks to me anymore," without much curiosity about what happened to the man who used to talk plenty. Picture a woman who tells her friends her husband's become distant and hard to read, genuinely puzzled by it, while the pattern that trained that silence played out over years right in front of her. What this costs the relationship is a complete disconnect between cause and effect. The silence gets treated as a mysterious personality change instead of a predictable response to how his voice was actually received for years. On the ledger, a partner's honest engagement spent down gradually until quiet becomes the rational, self-protective default. The tragedy of this entry is specifically the mislabeling. The very silence that was trained into him becomes the evidence used against him, as if the quiet arrived on its own instead of being the predictable output of years of the same experiment producing the same result. The fourth entry is intimacy used as leverage specifically, and it deserves to be named plainly because softening it doesn't help anyone. Using physical or emotional closeness as a tool, offered when a partner behaves in approved ways, withdrawn when they don't, communicates something far deeper than whoever's using it usually intends. It tells the other person that their most basic need for connection is conditional, that desire for them isn't actually desire, it's currency, spent when useful and withheld when leverage is needed. A person who understands this about their own relationship, even if they never say it in those words, experiences something specific, feeling like a variable being managed rather than a partner being loved, rewarded for compliance and quietly penalized for independence. Picture a man who starts to notice that affection reliably shows up after he's agreed with something and reliably disappears after he's pushed back. Once he sees the pattern clearly, he can't unsee it. What this costs the relationship is the one thing that was supposed to be evidence of genuine desire, converted into evidence of something closer to management. On the ledger, intimacy repriced as a reward system, which changes its meaning permanently even after the leverage stops being used. That's the part that makes this entry so costly. Once someone has clocked the pattern, restoring the original meaning of affection takes far longer than it took to damage it, because trust in a signal isn't rebuilt on the same timeline it was broken on. The fifth entry is what happens to the person on the receiving end of that pattern if it holds long enough to become a habit rather than an occasional bad stretch. In the beginning, most people pursue. They try to reconnect, adjust their behavior, figure out what they did wrong and how to fix it, because they still believe the problem is solvable and the connection is worth restoring. But if the pattern repeats consistently enough that the link between compliance and affection becomes unmistakable, something shifts. He stops initiating, not because the need went away, but because initiating became the most reliable way to feel unwanted. Every reach that gets denied delivers information about his own standing, and that information, received enough times, produces a wound that doesn't bleed visibly. It closes over. He gets quieter, less warm, flatter, the particular affect of someone who stopped expecting warmth from a source that used to reliably provide it. Picture a partner noticing this shift and calling it him pulling away, genuinely wondering what happened to the person she married without connecting the cold, present tense man to years of reaching and being denied. What this costs both people is a wall built one brick at a time by the exact pattern that's now being mourned. On the ledger, a need that didn't disappear only went underground, where it surfaces eventually as distance, resentment, or a slow emotional exit that everyone around the couple can see except the person who built the wall. This is the part that tends to blindside people because the man standing there quiet and distant looks from the outside, like someone who simply stopped caring. He didn't. Underneath the withdrawal is usually still someone who wanted to be wanted, not for what he provides or agrees to, but simply because he was chosen and that choice still meant something. That need doesn't vanish when it stops being met. It just stops announcing itself. The sixth entry is the mindset underneath all of this, because the pattern rarely comes from cruelty. It usually comes from a specific, mistaken framework. Some people operate, often without ever naming it this way even to themselves, as if the relationship were a competition with limited resources. What he gets, she doesn't get. What she gives freely, she loses. Every concession registers as a small defeat. Every withholding is a form of self-protection. That framework produces exactly the behavior described in the last few entries. Pressure campaigns instead of honest persuasion, because genuine dialogue feels like exposure. Withholding instead of freely giving, because giving feels like losing leverage. Treating a partner's needs as bargaining chips, because meeting them simply out of love feels naive rather than wise. What this costs the relationship is the foundation itself, because the framework is wrong at the root. Closeness isn't zero-sum. What you give to a partner who feels genuinely at peace and genuinely desired doesn't diminish you. It tends to multiply, because a partner who comes home to peace has more of himself to bring back into the relationship than a partner who comes home to management. The seventh entry is a picture worth holding in your mind because it makes the whole mechanism concrete. Two versions of essentially the same relationship, same two people at the start, different operating framework. In the first version, one partner leads with leverage, withholding peace when she's not getting what she wants, withholding affection when she needs compliance, tracking carefully to make sure she's never giving more than she's getting, believing this makes her strategic. 5 years in, he's quiet in ways he wasn't before, agreeing to things he doesn't believe because disagreeing costs too much, going through the motions of presence, while the part of him that used to be genuinely present has learned to live somewhere she can't reach. She looks at him and doesn't recognize him, tells people he changed. He didn't change. He adapted to the environment he was living in. In the second version, one partner leads with generosity, offering peace, not as a behavioral reward, but as the foundation everything else depends on, offering affection freely because freely given desire is the only kind that means anything, engaging his actual perspective because a partner whose voice matters stays invested. 5 years in, that same starting point man is visibly present, motivated, generous in ways nobody had to demand or negotiate for, because generosity was simply the language of the environment he was living in. She says she got lucky, found a good man. She didn't find a different man. She built a different relationship with the same raw material. The eighth entry, and the one worth sitting with longest if you're a man watching this, is that this exact mechanism runs in both directions, and it's worth auditing your own side of it before assuming you're only ever on the receiving end. A man can just as easily withhold financial transparency as leverage in a disagreement, use decision-making authority as a reward for a partner's compliance, or go cold and withdraw affection deliberately to punish rather than to communicate. Picture a man who's watched this entire video nodding along about what's been done to him, without noticing that he does his own version of it, going silent and unavailable specifically when he wants his partner to feel the cost of a disagreement rather than actually engaging her reasoning. What this costs him is the standing to ask for something he's not willing to give in return. The reframe is to run this same audit on yourself with the same honesty you'd want applied to a partner. Where in your relationship have you made something conditional that should have been freely given? The ninth entry is worth naming directly because it's the part that makes this pattern so persistent even in relationships where the love is completely genuine. Love in the abstract and self-protection in the specific can exist in the same person at the same time. Most people running this pattern genuinely love their partner and would say so sincerely and mean it. But love that doesn't extend into the actual specific moment, the moment where the desire to win a disagreement conflicts with a partner's need for peace, the moment where the pull toward leverage conflicts with a partner's need for genuine connection, isn't functioning as love in that particular moment. It's functioning as preference. And in that moment, the preference is winning. Picture two partners who would each honestly describe deep love for the other, while one of them still reaches for leverage every time a real disagreement shows up, without ever connecting that reflex to the erosion happening slowly underneath it. What this costs the relationship is the gap between the love someone genuinely feels and the love someone actually practices in the hard, specific moments. A gap that the person on the receiving end experiences as very real, regardless of how sincere the feeling underneath it happens to be. On the ledger, sincere love, undermined by specific behavior that contradicts it, which is a harder problem to fix than a lack of love would be because there's no absence to address. only a pattern to interrupt. Add it all up and here's the full ledger. What leverage extracts from whichever partner it's aimed at, peace converted from a baseline into a reward, honest disagreement replaced by attrition, a partner's voice worn down until silence becomes the rational default, intimacy repriced as currency instead of connection, a wound that closes over and surfaces later as distance nobody traces back to its actual cause. A relationship run on a zero-sum framework that guarantees both people end up with less, and sincere love undercut by specific behavior that contradicts it in exactly the moments that matter most. What generosity produces instead, in the same relationship with the same two people, presence that doesn't have to be demanded, motivation that shows up without negotiation, and a partnership that looks effortless from the outside precisely because nobody inside it is keeping score. Now here's what you actually do with this. First, if you recognize yourself on the receiving end of this pattern, name it directly and specifically rather than absorbing it silently for years. I've noticed peace and closeness here tend to depend on whether I've agreed with you, and I need to understand that is a hard sentence to say, but a much harder one to keep living without saying. Second, if you recognize your own behavior in the leverage side of this, withholding something a partner needs as a way of managing a disagreement, say so honestly before it hardens into a permanent habit neither of you can name later. Naming it yourself carries far more weight than being caught in it. Third, learn to tell the difference between honest persuasion and a pressure campaign in either direction. Honest persuasion engages the actual reasoning behind a position. A pressure campaign just makes the position more exhausting to hold than to abandon. Notice which one you're running the next time you disagree with someone you love. Fourth, if you've gone quiet in your own relationship, understand what that silence is actually communicating and consider saying the thing out loud instead of just withdrawing further. Silence reads as apathy from the outside even when it's actually self-protection. Fifth, treat generosity as an investment rather than a risk. Peace and desire that are freely given without being metered against compliance tend to come back multiplied rather than lost, but only if both people actually believe that and act on it, not just one. And sixth, if this pattern has been running long enough to build real distance, get outside help before deciding it's unfixable. A pattern built over years usually needs more than a single honest conversation to fully unwind, and there's no weakness in getting support to do that work properly. And seventh, remember that feeling love and practicing it in the hard, specific moments are two different things, and the gap between them is where this entire pattern actually lives. The next time a real disagreement puts your own peace or leverage against your partner's need for either one, notice which one you reach for by default. That single moment, repeated enough times, is what actually determines which of the two relationships from the last entry you end up building. None of this is about assigning blame permanently to one side of a relationship. It's about naming a mechanism clearly enough, in either direction, that it stops running on autopilot. So here's my question for you, and I want something specific in the comments. Have you lived on either side of this pattern, the one withholding or the one slowly going quiet, and what was the moment you actually noticed it happening? This has been Robbin for The Honest Ledger, the channel that reads the fine print nobody hands you. If this names something you've felt but never had the words for, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want the rest of the ledger opened up, one entry at a time.